Hello everyone and welcome to the sixth video for Life on Earth. You should now know all about limiting factors of photosynthesis, and you should be able to pause the video and answer the question before I go over the answers. So the answer is that X has to be what's on the X-axis, so it would be light intensity is limiting the rate of photosynthesis here. And then Y, so the line beyond that, must be something else. So we know that it's got a low concentration of carbon dioxide on that line, and then on this line we've got a high concentration of carbon dioxide, and obviously this causes the rise. So what must be limiting it at Y? It must be carbon dioxide concentration. Then the next question says, suggest one way that the rate of photosynthesis can be measured. So the way that photosynthesis can be measured is by measuring the oxygen produced per unit of time, or by counting the number of oxygen bubbles produced per unit of time. So well done if you managed to get that correct. Or you could have put the volume of carbon dioxide used per unit time. So if you struggled to answer the question, remember you can go back and watch the other videos on photosynthesis as many times as you want. Today we're going to be learning about key area 4, which is energy in the ecosystem. If you want the worksheets that go with the video, remember to pause the video and go to Free Life on Earth for energy in the ecosystem, 2 consumables and activities. And the PowerPoint is found in PowerPoints and it's called For Energy in the Ecosystem. So today we're going to be learning about how to define the ecological terms producer, consumer, herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, predator, prey, food chain and food web. We're going to be able to explain that in transfers from one level to the next in a food chain, the majority of energy is lost as heat movement or undigested materials. State that only a very small quantity is used for growth and is therefore available at the next level of food chain. Define and compare pyramids of numbers and energy, and explain interactions in a food web, and know the effects of removing a species from a food web. So to be successful, you'll be able to define the ecological terms producer, consumer, herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, predator, prey, food chain, food web. Explain that in transfers from one level to the next in a food chain, the majority of energy is lost as heat movement or undigested materials. State that only a very small quantity is used for growth and is therefore available at the next level in a food chain. Define and compare pyramids of number and energy, and explain the interactions in a food web and know the effects of removing a species from a food web. Firstly, let's look at the words you need to know, starting with producer. So you should have learned what the word producer is in previous years, so pause the video and try to write down a definition of producer. So the answer is that a producer is something that can produce and make its own food. So how do we think that producers make their own food? A clue is that we talked about it in the last lesson. So well done if you said photosynthesis. So usually producers are green plants and they make their food from photosynthesis, and producers will always be the first thing in a food chain. So producers always usually get their energy from the sun. The next term that you need to try to define is consumer. So pause the video and try to write down what you think consumer is. So the answer is that a consumer needs to get its energy from feeding on another organism. So there are basically 3 main groups of consumer. So basically anything that is not a green plant, and you get herbivores, carnivores and omnivores, which we're going to look at in more detail. Here's some pictures. So let's look at herbivore first. So what do you think a herbivore is before I go over the answer? So a herbivore is a consumer that gets its energy by feeding on plants. So basically it's an organism that only eats plants, so it's like a vegetarian. So here's some examples like rabbits and zebras and squirrels and caterpillars, etc. The next one that we're going to look at is carnivore. So write down what you think a carnivore is before I go over the answer. The answer is that it is a consumer that gets its energy by feeding on animals. So basically an animal that feeds on only animals. So you get like eagles, cheetahs, tigers, lions, etc. Finally, let's look at the word omnivore. So pause the video and write down what you think an omnivore would eat. So the answer is that an omnivore is a consumer that gets its energy by feeding on both plants and animals. So it's not fussy. So that's like pigs, bears, humans, gorillas, etc. It's important that you learn the words producer, consumer, omnivore, herbivore, and carnivore before you move on to the next part of this video. So let's look at a pond ecosystem and do some revision about the keywords that we've already heard before. So pause the video and try to fill out the blanks before I go over the answers with you. So the answers are that the pond is the habitat of the sticklebacks, it's where they live. The heron is the predator of the stickleback, it eats it. The stickleback are the prey of the heron, they get eaten. The waterweed is the producer because it's a plant and it produces its own food by photosynthesis. All of the sticklebacks make up a population. All of the plants and animals in the pond make up a community, which is all the living things. And herons and sticklebacks are examples of consumers. So an animal which gets its energy from other living things. Well done if you managed to get all of them correct. If not, then you need to go back and watch the start of the video and also watch the ecosystem video. So how does energy flow in an ecosystem? Energy is required by all living organisms. We need it for moving, growing, and releasing undigested waste. We get energy from our food. There are feeding relationships which exist in every ecosystem which allows the flow of energy from one organism to another. All energy comes from the sun. Anything you eat, you can backtrack to eating something that has ate a plant that makes its energy from the sun. For example, if I had bacon for my breakfast, I would have got my energy by eating the pig. The pig would have got its energy from eating leaves, which get their energy from the sun by photosynthesis. You can do this with any food that you eat and trace it back to a plant and trace it back to the sun. So can you remember how we would display the energy flow from third year and how we would manage to put in that feeding relationship that I have just said? Pause the video and try to write down what you think it would be before I go over the answer. The answer is we display this energy flow in a food chain. A food chain is a diagram which shows how energy is passed from one organism to another organism. It shows a simple feeding relationship. So as you can see, food chains always start with the producer, which make its own food. So in this case, our producer would be the oak. Then you have an arrow. Now the arrows point in the direction of what is eating it, and the arrow represents the direction of energy flow. So the caterpillar is getting energy from the oak because it's eating it. So the first thing that comes after the producer is always called the primary consumer. Then we've got another arrow, and remember the arrows represent the direction of energy flow. So the blackbird is getting its energy from the caterpillar because again it's eating it. And when it comes after the primary consumer, it is said to be a secondary consumer. Now, if there was something else eating the blackbird, it would then be called a tertiary consumer. So you can remember this because you will have went to primary school first, and then you will have went to secondary school second. A top tip to remember is that the arrows always go in the direction of the thing that's eating its mouth, okay? So that is a top tip there. So we always start with producer, then we have primary consumer, and then we have a secondary consumer. So let's go try to make a food chain ourselves. Now see if you can pause the video and make a food chain with the words and pictures. Also label each of the pictures with its role in the food chain before I go over the answers. So the answer would be that grass is a plant, so it would come first because it would be the producer, and so it should be labeled producer. And then you would want to have your arrow, which shows the direction of energy flow, and then you'd want to put where the energy is going to go from the grass, so it would go into the rabbit. So our rabbit could be called a primary consumer because it comes straight after the producer, and it also could be a herbivore because it only eats a plant, and it could also be the prey because it's going to be eaten by something else. And then we've got another arrow again to show the direction of energy flow, and then we've got our fox. Our fox eats the rabbit and it eats the primary consumer, so it must be a secondary consumer. is a carnivore because it only eats animals, and it's also a predator. So well done if you managed to sort the pictures, the words out correctly. Make sure you understand food chains before you move on. As I have said, the primary consumer is the second organism in a food chain or in a food web. It will eat the plant, so therefore energy is transferred from the plant to the animal. A secondary consumer is the third organism in the food chain or in the food web, and it will eat the animal that eats the producer, and energy is transferred from the first animal to the second animal. A tertiary consumer is the fourth organism in the food chain or in the food web, and it will eat the animal, and the energy is transferred from the second animal to the third animal. Pause the video and try to label the food chain with the words we went over before I go over the answers. So the answer is that the acorn is the producer, as it makes its own food. The wood mouse is the primary consumer, as it eats the producer. The weasel is the secondary consumer, as it eats the primary consumer. And the owl is the tertiary consumer because it eats the secondary consumer. Well done if you managed to get that correct. If you didn't, then go back and watch food chains again. And do you remember what the arrows show? So the answer is that the arrows show the direction of energy flow. So all of the acorn's energy does not pass to the wood mouse, as the acorn needs to use some of its own energy. Just like all the wood mouse's energy does not pass to the weasel, and all the weasel's energy does not pass to the owl. So most of the energy is lost at each stage of the food chain, and only a small amount of energy is passed on. So how is the energy lost at each stage of the food chain? Pause the video and write down what you think before I go over the answer. So the answer is that in transfers from one level to the next in a food chain, the majority of energy is lost as heat, movement, undigested materials. A total of 90% energy is therefore lost at each stage of the food chain from heat, movement, and undigested materials. So how much energy is then passed on? Pause the video and write down how much energy you think can be passed on and how it will be passed on. The answer is that only 10% of energy is passed on. So only a very small quantity of energy is passed on, and it's used for growth and is therefore available at the next level in a food chain. So if you get asked the question of how is the energy passed from one organism to another, it will always be through growth. Try to pause the video and fill out the blanks before I go over the answers with you. The answer is that at each stage of the food chain, approximately 90% of energy is lost as heat, or in movement, or in undigested waste. So only 10% of the energy is passed on from one stage to the next. Well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, go back to the start of the video. As well as food chains, you need to know about pyramid diagrams. You need to know how they can be used to represent features of a food chain. You need to be able to know the definition of both types of pyramid diagrams, and you need to be able to compare the pyramid of numbers and the pyramid of energy. So let's look at the pyramid of numbers first. So here's a food chain. It starts with green plants, which would be what? Well done if you said it would be the producer. Then we have the slugs, which would be what? It would be the primary consumer because it eats the producer. And then we have the frogs, which would be the secondary consumer because it eats the primary consumer. And then we have a fox, which would be the tertiary consumer because it eats the secondary consumer. So what do we notice? The size and number of organisms as you go along the food chain. So pause the video and write down what is happening. So the answer is that the organisms get bigger and fewer as you go along a food chain. Well done if you managed to see that in like that pattern. So now let's put this in a diagram so that we can see this easier. A diagram that we can put this in is called the pyramid of numbers. In a pyramid of numbers, the producer is always at the bottom of the pyramid. So in this case, it would be the grass because that is the producer. Then there is the primary consumer next on the top. which would be the slugs. And then above the slugs, you would put the secondary consumer, which would be the frogs. And then above the frogs, you'd put the tertiary consumer, which would be the fox. So you need to learn the definition for pyramid of numbers. So the definition for a pyramid of numbers is that it's a diagram which shows the number of each organism at each stage in a food chain. The bold words are important, so pause this video until you learn that whole definition. So make sure you know and can say that a pyramid of numbers is a diagram which shows the number of each organism at each stage in a food chain. So you can see that in the pyramid, the more and higher the number of organisms there is, the wider the base. So for example, the grass stage has a wide base, and then it gets smaller with the slugs, and smaller with the frogs, and smaller with the foxes. So that means that there's lots and lots of grass, followed by less slugs, followed by less frogs, followed by less foxes. So that is how you would draw a pyramid of numbers. So usually, as you go up a pyramid of numbers, the size of organisms increases and the number of organisms decreases, so you end up having a pyramid shape. However, there are exceptions to this. So pause the video and write down when you think there would be an exception to this before I go over the answer. So the answer is that sometimes pyramids of numbers can be unusual shape and form irregular pyramids. And this is when the producer is very large, so it's only got one producer compared to all the things that eat off of its leaves, like a tree and then caterpillars eating on it. Or another time that you'd get an irregular pyramid is if the final consumer is very, very small. So like this could be bacteria or a parasite, so there'd be tons and tons of them. So there's your two irregular shaped pyramids there. So you can see that the base for the oak tree, there's only one of them, so it's very, very small. And then you've got your lots and lots of caterpillars, and then it gets smaller for blue tit, and then it gets really small for sparrowhawk. And then you see for when there's a really small, like tertiary top consumer, you've got grass, that's really a large number. Then you've got grasshoppers, which has a smaller number. Then shrews with a smaller number. Then owls with a smaller number. And then all of a sudden you get this big, huge bar, and that's because the fleas are smaller, so there's going to be more of them. So make sure you understand pyramids of numbers, you understand when they're going to be an irregular shape, and you understand the definition of it. The advantage of pyramid of numbers is that it is relatively easy to count organisms. The disadvantage is that it does not always show a true pyramid shape because it does not take account of size, mass, or energy stored in an organism. So pause the videos and try to learn the advantages and disadvantages of pyramid of numbers before you move on. Now try to make your own pyramid of numbers by using these two food chains. Try to get the correct shape of both of the pyramids for the food chains, and make sure you label each part of the pyramid before I go over the answer. So the answer is that for the grassland food chain, we should have got grass that had a big base, then rabbits, which was smaller, and then foxes, which was even smaller in number. And then for the woodland pyramid of numbers, you should have had a really small base for the oak tree, then you should have lots and lots of caterpillars, so bigger base for that, and then less birds, so smaller base for that. So well done if you managed to get the shape of the pyramid correct for both of the food chains. If not, go back to the start of this video. Now let's see if you can work out which statement goes with which pyramid. Give yourself 1 minute and pause the video before I go over the answer. So for description 1, it says an oak tree supported by lots of bird life. The birds are haunted by the fox. Description 2 is a cornfield where field mice live. Foxes prey on the field mice. And description 3 is an oak tree is infected with beetles. Bacteria infect the beetles. So the answer would be that description 1, an oak tree supports lots of bird life. The birds are hunted by foxes. would match to C. And the reason being is you have an oak tree, so it's going to have a small base, and then you've got, it supports lots of birds, so that's got to be a lot more numbers of birds. And then your birds are hunted by foxes, so it's going to be a smaller number of foxes. So description 1 will match with C. Description 2, a cornfield where mice live and then foxes prey on the field mice. So that one is going to be B. And the reason it's going to be B is because cornfields is going to have a lot of numbers, and then it's going to get less number for the mice and then even less number for the foxes, so it's going to form a pyramid. And then description 3, an oak tree is infected with beetles, bacteria infect the beetles. This is going to be A. So you're going to have your oak tree, which is going to be a really, really small base, then you're going to have lots of beetles, and then you're going to have even more bacteria because they are small. So your A, obviously, and C are showing you the exemption of where the pyramid of numbers creates a pyramid shape. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, then go back and watch the video again. Try to pause the video and answer the question before I go over the answer. So the question is, diagram below shows an unusual pyramid of numbers. Which of the following food chains could be represented by the pyramid? Tick the correct box. So firstly, we need to look at how many stages there are. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's going to be a food chain with 4 different things in it. And all of the food chains have 4 different things in it. And then we need to look at the bottom. So is it got a large number or is it got a small number? And if we know if it's got a small base, then it's got to be a tree. So the only one it can be is the oak tree, and then caterpillar, then blue tits and sparrowhawk. So it's got only one tree, and then it'll have lots more caterpillars, and then it'll have less blue tits and then less sparrowhawk. So well done if you managed to select number 2. Other pyramid you need to be able to describe is a pyramid of energy. A pyramid of energy is a diagram that shows total energy available at each stage in a food chain. Energy is measured in kilojoules per meter squared per year. You need to pause the video and learn the definition of the pyramid of energy before you move on to the next part of the video. So pyramids of energy have a similar structure to pyramids of number, but instead of looking at the organism's number, you're looking at the energy at each stage. So the first organism at the base of the pyramid will be the producer. The second organism will be the primary consumer. The third will be the secondary consumer. And the top will be the tertiary consumer. You need to learn and know that pyramids of energy always take a regular true pyramid shape, and this is because energy is always lost at each stage of the food chain, and they are therefore the most accurate representation of what is happening in a food chain. So energy is lost at each stage of the food chain, so decomposers fit into each level. So make sure you know that, because often you'll get asked why the pyramids of energy always take a true pyramid shape, or why are they always pyramids, and you need to be able to say that they're always pyramids because energy is lost at each stage of the food chain. So learn that before you move on to the next part. The advantage of the pyramid of energy is it reflects how much energy is going into and through the ecosystem over time, and it always shows a true pyramid. The disadvantage of the pyramid of energy is that it's very hard to measure and could damage the ecosystem, as to measure the energy it involves burning the organism. Now try to pause the video and do the activity before I go over the answers. The activity says a rose bush contains 9,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year of energy. 90% is lost at each link in the food chain. Draw a pyramid of energy showing the energy available at each stage. So the answer is, you could have done either of these pyramid pictures, either would be correct, but you would need to have the rose at the base because it's the producer, and we know that the rose has got 9,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year, and we know that only 10% of energy is getting passed on. So for the green fly, 10% of 9,000 would be 900, so you can either divide that 9,000 by 10 to get that, or you can times it by 10 and divide it by 100, whatever way you work out 10%. And then for the secondary consumer, ladybirds, there would only be 10% passed to them, so again you divide it by 10, so it would be 90 kilojoules per meter squared per year. And then finally for the thrush, it would be 9 kilojoules per meter squared per year. So well done if you managed to get these diagrams correct. If not, go back and look at this video again. We've already looked at food chains in this video. So we've got our producer, the oak, our primary consumer, the caterpillar, and our secondary consumer, the blackbird, and the arrows show the direction of energy flow. But a simple food chain is a very dodgy strategy. What would happen to the blackbirds if all of the caterpillars were killed by a disease? Pause the video and write down what you think would happen. The answer is that the blackbirds would go extinct as they would lose their only food source. How do you think the blackbirds could overcome this problem? Pause this video and write out what you think. So the blackbird should have different food sources. So even if the caterpillar died out, then the blackbird would still be able to survive. In reality, blackbirds also eat earthworms. They also eat fruit. They also eat spiders and snails, etc. So even if one of their food sources become extinct, they would stay alive. Caterpillars are the same. They don't only eat just oak, they also eat grass, they eat bark, moss, and lots of other things. So in reality, most organisms are in more than one food chain, and these all link up to form a food web. So when there's more than one food chain linked together, it's called a food web. A food web is therefore defined as a complex feeding relationship composed of several interrelated food chains, and you need to know its definition. From the food web, you can separate it into different food chains. So for example, I could separate this food web into and take the grass out and put it with going to the rabbit and then going to the fox. So that would give me one food chain. I could take the grass, insects, the vole, and then the hawk and put it into a food chain. I could take the grass, the slug, the thrush, the hawk and put it into a food chain, but you should be used to doing this from third year. So in an ecosystem, many food chains interconnect to form a food web, and this is an example of a food web with over 20 food chains, so it is quite complicated. Read the story and use it to try to create your own food web. Pause the video and try to complete the food web before I go over the answer. So the passage says that grass is eaten by rabbits and voles, dandelions are eaten by snail, voles and rabbits, weasels eat voles, thrushes eat snails, and foxes eat rabbits, voles, thrushes and weasels. So first of all, for the answer, we need to first start off with the producers. So we know producers make their own food, so they are usually plants. So the two plants in this would be the grass and the dandelion. So we start with them at the bottom of our food web. Then we need to do what eats the grass and what eats the dandelions. So rabbits and voles eat the grass, and snails, voles, and rabbits eat the dandelions. So then we know that our weasels eat our voles. So let's look at the secondary consumers. And our thrush eats our snail. So we need to add our arrows. And our foxes eat our rabbits, voles, thrushes, and weasels. So our fox is a tertiary consumer, but it's also a secondary consumer. So well done if you managed to get that correct. In this diagram, the rabbit, the vole, and the snail are all herbivores because they're only eating plants. The weasel, the thrush, and the fox are carnivores because they're only eating animals. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, then go back over it. Pause the video and write out this FIDWeb so you can use it to answer the next set of questions on the next part of the video. So pause and write down the FIDWeb. So the questions are: list the producers, list the herbivores, list the consumers, list the predators, what are the primary consumers, what are the secondary consumers, what are the tertiary consumers. If all the weasels were to get a disease, what would happen to the numbers of wood mice and numbers of shrews? What do the arrows in a food chain or food web show? Select two food chains from the web and create a pyramid of energy for your two food chains. If oak leaf has 20,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year of energy and acorn has 500,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year of energy. So these questions will just review your learning. So pause the video and answer the questions before I go over the answer. The answers would be that your acorn and your oak leaf would be your producers. Your herbivores would be your bankful, your wood mouse, and your caterpillar because they eat plants. Your list of consumers would be your weasels, your shrew, and your owl, and your bankful, and your wood mouse, and your caterpillar, basically anything that's not a producer. And the list of predators would be your shrew, your weasel, and your owl. And what are your primary consumers would be your bankful, your wood mouse, and your caterpillar because they eat the producers. And what are the secondary consumers would be your shrew and your weasel, and also your owl would be a secondary consumer as well. And what is a tertiary consumer would be your owl. So well done if you managed to get them correct. If not, then go back and watch the video again. The answer to the next question would be that the wood mice would increase because there would be less predators, which are the weasels, to eat them. The shrew would increase because owls would eat more shrew to compensate for the loss of the weasels, which was one of their food sources. Well done if you managed to get that correct. We did quite a lot of that in third year, but we will go over that in more detail. And then the arrows in the food chain represent the direction of energy flow. And you could have selected any two of these from the food web. So you've got your oak leaf, and then you've got your caterpillar, shrew, and owl. You've got your acorn, your wood mouse, your weasel, and your owl. Your acorn, your bankful, and your owl. Your acorn, your bankful, and your weasel, and your owl. So you had to pick two of these to then make your pyramids with. So you should have a pyramid that looks like this. Well, two of them. So if you picked the oak leaf, then you would have had 20,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year. And then for the caterpillar, you would have 2,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year. And then the shrew would have 200 kilojoules per meter squared per year. And then the owl would have 20 kilojoules per meter squared per year. And that would have been the order because obviously the producer starts first, then primary consumer, secondary, and then tertiary consumer. If you picked the acorn, it would have started with 500,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year. And then you could have picked the wood mouse, the weasel, and the owl, which obviously would have been divided by 10 each time you went up. Or you could have picked the acorn, the bankful, and the owl, or you could have picked the acorn, the bankful, the weasel, and the owl. So well done if you managed to make it into the pyramid shape and managed to get all of the calculations correct. If you didn't, then make sure you watch the video again. Your next challenge is to try to complete a food web using the information in this table. This should take you less than 10 minutes, so pause the video and do this before I go over the answers. So the answer is that we need to start with the food that is not a consumer but is food. So the only ones that are not consumers but are food is your algae and your pondweed. So you find them in the food column but not in the consumer column. Then you need to look for what eats the algae and the pondweed, and then you start building it up. So the food web that you should have got is your pondweed, your algae, which were your producers, and then you should have got your water flea, your caddis fly larvae, and your snail all get their energy from the algae. Your tadpole gets its energy from your pondweed, so they would be your primary consumers, and you just take that from the table. Then your secondary consumers that you should have got would have been your stickleback that gets its energy from the water flea. The water beetle also gets its energy from the water flea, and then your water beetle gets its energy from caddisfly larvae, tadpole. Then your perch gets its energy from your tadpole, the water beetle, and then your pike gets its energy from perch, tadpole, water beetle, and stickleback. So well done if you managed to get all of that correct. If you didn't, then go back and watch the video again. So what do you think would happen if we removed the water beetles? Pause the video and write down what you think would happen before we go over the answers. So let's remove the water beetle. So the answer is that the perch and the pike would decrease, most likely because they've lost a food source. Then your water flea, caddisfly larvae, and tadpole would likely increase because they've lost a predator, unless you argue that they will be eaten more by the perch and pike, so they stay the same. So as long as you can justify your answer and it makes sense, you will get your mark, but it's probably better to stick to increase or decrease and make it easier for yourself. So the pondweed and the algae, they will probably decrease because there's an increase in the number of caddisfly larvae, water flea, and tadpole because they've lost their predator. The snails will decrease because there'll be more competition from the tadpoles because again they've lost their predator. The stickleback could increase because it has more water fleas to eat, or it could decrease because pike might use it more as an alternative food source. So well done if you managed to get all of that correct. We're going to go over more removal of species from a food chain just to make sure that you understand it. So let's practice it some more. So write down what you think would happen if the vole was removed from this food web before I go over the answer. So pause the video now. So the answer is that the grass and dandelions will increase because only the rabbits and snails will be left to eat them. So take away the vole, grass and dandelion have lost the predator. And then we've got our snails and our rabbit will increase because they have more food, so they'll have more grass and dandelions to eat. Our thrushes, they will increase because they'll have more snails to eat. And then our weasels, they will disappear because they've lost their food source. And foxes will decrease because some of their prey, so they eat the voles and the weasels, have decreased. So well done if you managed to get all that correct. If not, then go back and watch the start of this video. So let's try some more questions. So if all of the tadpoles disappeared, what would happen to the population of water fleas and why? What would happen to the population of ducks and why? What would happen to the population of snails and why? So pause the video and try to answer the questions before I go over the answer. So remember, it is your tadpoles that are disappearing. So the answers are the water fleas would decrease, and this is because their predator, the dragonfly larvae, has lost one of its food sources, so will eat more water fleas as an alternative to compensate. The ducks, on the other hand, would increase, and this is because the snails would increase as there is less competition for the algae on the stones. So the ducks would have more snails to eat. And then finally, the snails would increase, and the reason why would be because there would be less competition for the algae on the stones, so they'd have more food to eat. Well done if you got that correct. If not, then go back and watch the start of this video again. Pause the video and write out this food web so you can use it to answer the questions. So the questions are: write down 2 food chains from this food web. Remember to add arrows in the correct direction. Number 2 is predict what will happen to the number of clownfish if the zooplankton is lost from the food web. Explain your answer. And number 3 is predict what might happen to the number of sea turtles if the clownfish and blue regal populations dramatically reduced. Explain your answer. So pause the video and try to answer the questions before I go over the answers. So the answers are, you could have picked any two food chains from algae going to zooplankton to clownfish to great white shark, algae going to sea turtle to great white shark, or algae going to small invertebrates to blue regal to great white shark, or algae going to blue regal to great white shark, or algae going to clownfish to going to great white shark. So for 2, the clownfish population would decrease if the zooplankton was lost from the food web, as they would have lost one of their food sources. And for 3, if the clownfish and blue regal populations decreased, the sea turtle would be the only food source for the great white shark, causing the sea turtle population to decrease, as the great white shark would need to compensate for its loss of its 2 food sources. Well done if you managed to get all that correct. If not, then watch the video again. For this next question, you need to pause the video and write down the table so that you can answer the question on the next page. So make sure you've written down the table and pause the video before I go to the next part. So the question is, use the information in the table to complete the food web below, and what term is used to describe the snapper in the ecosystem? So the answer is, you've got your diatom, which is your other producer. Then you've got your the sweep eats the diatom and gets its energy from the diatom. You've got your water fleas, your pilchard, and your snapper. So well done if you managed to get that correct. And the term used to describe the snapper in the ecosystem is either a secondary consumer or a tertiary consumer. Either or would have got you the mark. Well done if you managed to get that all correct. If not, then go watch the video again. The next question is, a pod of dolphins arrive and feed on the snapper. Describe the effects this will have on the euphausid population. So you need the effect, which will be either increase, decrease, or stay the same, and then you need an explanation. So pause the video and write down what you think this is before I go over the answer. So the effect would be that the euphausid population would decrease, and the reason that it would decrease is because snappers eat pilchards and ballenis. If the dolphins ate the snappers, the number of pilchards and ballenis would increase, and these would then eat more euphausids, causing the population to decrease. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, then go to the start of the video. Finally, the last question is that scientists investigated the type of food eaten by 2 foxes, A and B. One fox lives in a town and the other lives in the countryside. The pie charts below show the results. So you've got your pie chart and then you've got your key for your pie chart. It says what percentage of the food eaten by fox A is wild birds and mammals. So we need to look at fox A, and then we needed to find out what wild birds and mammals looks like. So it's that. And we can quite clearly see that it's half the pie chart, so it would be 50%. So well done if you managed to get 50%. Then it says fox B eats 800 grams of food in one day. So we're looking at fox B now. How many grams of wild birds and mammals does it eat? So wild birds and mammals is that colour again. We can quite clearly see that's 25%, quarter. So 25 times 800. Oh, sorry, my writing's a little bit funny. And then equals, and then divide it by 100, which gives you 200 grams. Right, then it says which fox is most likely to be the one living in town, and give a reason for your answer. So the answer would be fox B, and the reason for the answer would be that the fox mostly eats food from waste bins. So waste bins would be found more in towns. That's why you would know that it was fox B that was living in towns. Well done if you managed to get that correct. You should now be able to do the key area energy past paper questions. You should also be able to do the Life on Earth exam practice questions on page 66 to 68 and the Food Web extra questions in the consumables. We have now come to the end of the lesson, so you should now be able to define ecological terms: producer, consumer, herbivore, carnivore, omnivore, predator, prey, food chain, and food web. You should be able to explain that in transfers from one level to the next in a food chain, the majority of energy is lost as heat movement or undigested waste. State that only a small quantity of energy is passed on and used for growth and is therefore available at the next level of the food chain. Define and compare pyramids of number and energy, and explain interactions in a food web and know the effect of removing a species from a food web. Well done if you can confidently do all of that. If you can't, you need to watch this video again. That is the end of the video tutorial. Woohoo! Thank you for listening.